The cold was not merely an absence of heat, it was a physical presence. It had weight and teeth, and it sank those teeth into the frozen mud of the town's only street, making every wagon rut a miniature, jagged canyon. It crept under the ill-fitting doors of the clapboard buildings and breathed its icy vapor onto the window panes, painting them with ferns of intricate, merciless frost. For the woman and her 6 children, huddled in the sliver of space between the general store and the assayer's office, the cold was a predator, slowly stalking the last of their warmth. She was an island of silent desperation in a sea of bustling, self-interested townspeople. They saw her, of course. It was impossible not to see the cluster of figures, the woman with her dark, exhausted eyes and the 6 children pressed against her like chicks seeking the last heat of a dying mother hen. They saw her, but they did not register her. She was a problem without a simple solution, and so, in the pragmatic calculus of the frontier, she was rendered invisible. Her clothes, thin and worn, spoke of a different climate, a different life left far behind. The oldest boy, perhaps 10, stood with a rigid spine, trying to mimic a man's stoicism, but the tremor in his jaw betrayed him. The younger ones were a tangle of limbs and patched wool, their faces chapped raw, their whimpers lost in the keening of the wind. The rancher saw them. He had been standing across the street, his business with the blacksmith concluded, his mind already turning toward the long, solitary ride back to his homestead. He was a man carved from the same hard material as the land itself, solid, deliberate, his face a landscape of quiet sorrows and unspoken history. He did not see a problem to be ignored. He saw a disquieting equation that did not balance. 7 figures. A coming blizzard, promised by the bruised purple of the sky to the north. A town that had already looked away. He watched them for a long time, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. He observed the way the woman shifted the smallest child, a bundled infant, inside her coat, trying to share a warmth she no longer possessed. He saw the oldest boy's fierce, futile glare at the passers-by. He noted the utter lack of hope in the woman's posture, a slump not of laziness, but of a spirit worn down to its very foundation. In their collective misery, he felt an unsettling echo of the profound emptiness that awaited him at his ranch, a silence that had grown too loud to bear since the fever had taken his wife and son 3 winters ago. He crossed the street. His boots made a heavy, rhythmic crunch in the frozen earth, a sound that cut through the wind. He did not approach them with pity, for pity was a soft, useless thing. He stopped a few feet away, a solid, deliberate shape that blocked the wind. The woman flinched, pulling her children closer, her eyes instantly wary. She had seen that look in men's eyes before, the predatory appraisal, the casual cruelty. But his eyes were different. They were flat, tired, and held a deep, resonant quiet. "You need work," he stated. It was not a question. Her voice, when it came, was a dry rustle, cracked with cold and disuse. "We need everything." He gave a slow, deliberate nod, his gaze sweeping over the 6 children, counting them as a stockman might count a herd. It was not an unkind assessment, but a practical one. "I have a ranch. There's work. Mending, cooking, cleaning. Enough for a roof and food. The storm will be here by nightfall." He did not offer comfort or charity. He offered a transaction, as stark and unadorned as the landscape around them. Survival in exchange for labor. The woman stared at him, searching his face for the trick, the hidden cost. She found nothing but a vast, weary honesty. She looked at her children, at the blue tinge on the baby's lips, at the hollows in her oldest son's cheeks. There was no choice here. There was only this man, this offer, and the encroaching teeth of the cold. The absence of any other option was its own kind of certainty. "We accept," she said, the words a puff of white in the frigid air. The rancher simply nodded again, turned, and started walking toward his wagon, not once looking back to see if they were following. He knew they would. The journey to his homestead was conducted in a thick, unbreachable silence. The woman and her children huddled in the back of the wagon, buried under a heavy, musty-smelling canvas tarp he had tossed to them without a word. It was the first act of impersonal care, a provision against the elements, not an offering of comfort. The rancher sat ramrod straight, his attention on the horses and the darkening trail. He could feel their eyes on his back, a collective weight of uncertainty and fear. He did not turn. The silence in his wagon was different from the silence in his cabin. This was a silence filled with breathing, with shivering, with the unspoken questions of 7 desperate souls. It was, he decided, a marginal improvement. They arrived as the first flakes of snow began to drift down from the iron-gray sky. The homestead was as stark as the man himself. A solid, well-built cabin, a large barn, and a web of corrals sat in a small valley, sheltered by a stand of stubborn pines. It was a place of brutal simplicity, clean and ordered, but profoundly empty. It was the home of a man who did not live in it so much as occupy it, a fortress against memory. Inside, a fire was already laid in the stone hearth. He struck a match, and the kindling caught, spitting and hissing as it devoured the dry wood. The small cabin was quickly filled with a flickering, dancing light that threw long shadows on the walls. He motioned for them to sit at the long wooden table while he moved about the room with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice. He put a pot of stew on to heat, its contents simple but hearty, and sliced a loaf of dense, dark bread. When the food was ready, he ladled the stew into 7 bowls and placed them on the table. The children stared at the steaming food as if it were a miracle. The woman murmured something in a language he did not recognize, a quiet word of thanks or a prayer, before they began to eat. They ate with a ravenous, desperate hunger that was painful to watch. They did not speak, their focus entirely on the act of filling the gnawing emptiness inside them. The rancher sat at the head of the table, nursing a cup of black coffee, watching them with a detached curiosity. He was a man who had acquired a necessity, a buffer against the encroaching silence, and now he was observing the nature of his acquisition. When they were finished, the bowls wiped clean with the last of the bread, a heavy drowsiness fell over the children. The woman's eyes, too, were heavy with an exhaustion that went bone deep. The loft, the rancher said, pointing a thumb toward a sturdy ladder leading to the upper level of the cabin. There are blankets and straw ticks. It's warm enough. He established the distance without malice. He had offered them a roof, not a home. He had given them food, not fellowship. He was their employer, their rescuer, but not their family. The kindness he had shown felt as sharp and as dangerous as the winter itself, a thing to be handled with caution. The woman understood this. She gathered her children, herding them toward the ladder with soft words, her pride a fragile shield against the indignity of her situation. She would not be a burden. She and her children would earn their keep. The blizzard descended that night, a howling vortex of wind and snow that sealed the small cabin off from the rest of the world. For 3 days, they were confined, a strange and silent assembly of castaways. The rancher moved through his chores with a restless energy, tending the fire, checking on the livestock in the barn, his movements a constant, steady rhythm against the storm's fury. The woman, after a day of deep, restorative sleep, set about proving her worth. She found his mending basket and, with nimble fingers, began to repair his worn shirts and canvas trousers. She cleaned the cabin with a thoroughness that polished the lonely space until it gleamed. Her older children, seeing their mother's quiet diligence, found their own small tasks. The boy kept the woodbox filled, and a girl, no older than 8, helped with the sweeping. He watched them work, his silence a constant, observant presence. He had expected noise, chaos, the disruption that 7 strangers, 6 of them children, would inevitably bring. Instead, they brought a quiet, purposeful hum. They moved around him, and around the deep well of his grief, with a cautious respect. They did not fill the silence with chatter. They replaced it with the soft sounds of life, the scratch of a needle through cloth, the whisk of a broom, the gentle murmur of a mother to her child. He found, to his surprise, that it was a better kind of silence. When the storm finally broke, it left a world remade in pristine, blinding white. The sun was sharp in a clean-swept sky, and the air was so cold it felt brittle. The work of digging out began. It was an immense, back-breaking task. The woman approached him as he pulled on his heavy coat. "We will help," she said. It was a statement, not a plea. He looked at her, then at the oldest boy who stood beside her, his face set with determination. The rancher was about to refuse, to tell them it was a man's work, but he saw the look in her eyes. It was a fierce insistence on her own value. They would not be sheltered pets, fed and kept for his convenience. They would be partners in their own survival. He gave a curt nod. Get your coats. He had expected them to be a hindrance, but he was wrong. The woman worked with a tireless, steady pace, her movements efficient. The boy, though small, shoveled snow with a grit that impressed the rancher. Even the older girls helped, carrying buckets of feed to the barn, their faces flushed with the cold and the effort. He found himself giving them gruff, minimal instructions, and they followed them with an intelligence and speed that belied their desperate appearance in town. They were not fragile. They were survivors. That afternoon, while clearing a path to the smokehouse, the boy stumbled upon a small, half-buried wooden chest. He called to the rancher, who came over and pried the frozen lid open. Inside, nestled in a faded cloth, were a few small, precious things: a woman's silver locket, a small leather-bound book of poetry, and a crudely carved wooden horse, its paint worn smooth by a child's hands. The rancher froze. He stared at the horse, and for a moment, the carefully constructed walls around his heart crumbled. He heard the echo of a small boy's laughter, felt the phantom weight of a small hand in his. He snatched the horse and shut the chest with a loud crack, his face a mask of stone. He turned and walked away without a word, the moment of vulnerability passing as quickly as it had come. But the woman had seen it. She had seen the flicker of immense pain in his eyes, and she understood that his emptiness was not a void, but a crater left by a loss too great to name. Weeks turned into a month. A routine settled over the ranch, as quiet and steady as the winter landscape. The presence of the woman and her children became a fact, woven into the fabric of the place. The foreman and the two ranch hands who lived in the bunkhouse had initially regarded the new arrivals with a wary curiosity, but their skepticism soon melted away in the face of the family's relentless work ethic and the quiet dignity with which they carried themselves. The woman's cooking was simple but plentiful, and the rancher's cabin, once a sterile shell, now smelled of baking bread and wood smoke. The fragile peace they had built was shattered on a trip to town for supplies. The rancher, the woman, and her oldest son rode in the wagon, the list of necessities clutched in her hand. The town, which had once ignored them, now stared. Whispers followed them like smoke, curling in their wake. The source of the whispers soon made herself known. She was the merchant's wife, a woman whose wealth and social standing gave her an unshakable sense of authority. She was dressed in fine wool, a stark and vibrant contrast to the rough-hewn world around her. She cornered them in the general store, her smile as thin and sharp as a shard of glass. "Well now," she began, her voice carrying across the silent store for the benefit of the other customers. "Our solitary rancher, playing the saint. Such a charitable man." Taking in strays, her eyes, cold and assessing, raked over the woman, lingering on her worn dress and foreign features with undisguised contempt. One has to wonder about the nature of such charity. The insinuation was ugly and clear. The woman stiffened, her face paling, her hand tightening on her son's shoulder. The boy glared at the merchant's wife with a hatred that was pure and absolute. The other shoppers pretended to be busy with their purchases, but their ears were tuned to the confrontation. The rancher, who had been inspecting a sack of flour, turned slowly. He did not raise his voice. He did not rush to their defense. He simply moved, placing his large, solid body between the merchant's wife and the woman. It was a simple, physical act of protection. "They are with me," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was not an explanation or a justification. It was a statement of fact, as unyielding as a granite boulder. He met the merchant's wife's gaze, and in his eyes, she saw not anger, but a profound and dangerous stillness. She saw a man who had nothing left to lose and who would not be moved. "It isn't proper," she sniffed, unwilling to back down completely. A woman of her kind, with all those children, living in a bachelor's home. "People will talk. Let them," the rancher said. He picked up his sack of flour, paid the suddenly flustered merchant, and ushered the woman and her son out of the store. The merchant's wife was left standing in the sudden silence, her face tight with fury. She had fired a warning shot, and in doing so, had made their private arrangement a matter of public concern. The fragile sanctuary of the ranch had been breached. The silence on the ride home was different from all the silences that had come before. It was heavy with unspoken things, with the ugliness of the town's prejudice, and with the new, undeniable reality of their situation. That night, after the children were asleep in the loft, the woman came down the ladder. The rancher was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames, the carved wooden horse from the chest held loosely in his hand. The cabin was filled with a tension that had not been there before. She stood for a moment, gathering her courage. Then she asked the question that had been haunting her for weeks. Why? Her voice was barely a whisper. Why did you help us? He did not look at her. He continued to stare into the fire, turning the small horse over and over in his calloused fingers. A long time passed. The only sounds were the crackle of the logs and the sigh of the wind outside. He seemed to be weighing the cost of words, of letting a piece of his locked-away past into the light. This place, he began, his voice rough, had too much nothing in it. A silence that screams. My wife and my boy, the fever took them. Winter, 3 years back, he said it plainly, without emotion, as if reporting on the weather. But the grip he had on the wooden horse told a different story. I saw you and your children. You had nothing left. I had too much nothing. Seemed like a way to make a better kind of silence. He was not offering his grief for sympathy. He was offering it as an explanation, a reason that she could understand. He was connecting his emptiness to her desperation. He had not rescued her out of kindness. He had brought her here to rescue himself from the ghosts that haunted his quiet cabin. The confession hung in the air between them, a fragile, painful truth. In response, she reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a small, intricate object. It was a butterfly, carved from a piece of pale green jade, but one of its wings was broken. My husband, she said softly, her own story spilling out to meet his. He was a good man, a scholar, not a farmer. We came from a land across the sea. We owed a man money, a powerful man from the city. My husband worked to pay the debt, but he grew sick. The man, the benefactor, he changed the terms. The contract my husband signed made us his property until the debt was paid. An impossible debt. She traced the broken wing of the jade butterfly. When my husband died, the man came for us. For me, and for my children. He said the debt was now ours to work off. We fled in the night. We have been running ever since. Now he understood. The threat was not the town's gossip or the winter cold. It was a man. A specific, tangible danger that was hunting them. The knowledge transformed his perspective. He was no longer just providing a roof against the elements. He had to provide a fortress against the world. He looked at her, at the quiet strength in her face, the fierce, protective love she had for her children. He saw a fellow survivor. He looked at the 6 sleeping children in the loft above. They were no longer strays he had taken in. They were a charge to be defended. The inevitable arrived with the spring thaw. A sleek, black carriage, utterly out of place in the muddy ranch yard, pulled up to the cabin. 2 men stepped out. One was the town's lawman, a weary but decent man caught in the middle of a dispute he clearly wanted no part of. The other was the man from the city. He was exactly as the woman had described him. Well-dressed, his suit immaculate, his face wearing a mask of smug, confident ownership. He did not see people. He saw assets to be collected. The rancher met them on the porch, the woman and her oldest son standing just inside the doorway behind him. I am here to collect my property, the man from the city said, his voice smooth and cold. He produced a sheaf of papers, the official-looking contract, and handed it to the lawman. A contract of indenture, signed and witnessed. The debt is considerable. This woman and her offspring are legally bound to serve me until it is repaid. The lawman read the document, his face grim. It appears to be in order, he said, avoiding the rancher's eyes. The law is the law. You have 3 days, the man from the city said, directing his words to the woman, ignoring the rancher completely. 3 days to prepare for your journey back. The lawman will see to it you do not run again, he smiled, a thin, predatory expression. Then he and the lawman departed, leaving the ultimatum hanging in the air like the scent of poison. Panic was a tangible thing in the small cabin. The woman was pale with terror, her composure finally cracking. The children, sensing the shift, were quiet and fearful. But the rancher's face was set like granite. The time for quiet observation was over. He won't take you, he said. It was a vow. That night, the cabin became a war room. The rancher pulled out a dusty box from under his bed, a relic from a life before the ranch. Inside were telegraph keys and code books. Worked for the railroad, back east, he explained gruffly. I still have contacts. He spent hours tapping out a coded message to a name in a city hundreds of miles away, a desperate long shot asking for any information on the benefactor. Meanwhile, the woman, her fear channeled into a sharp, focused intelligence, spread the indenture contract on the table. She could read and write fluently, a skill the man from the city had never bothered to discover. She and the rancher pored over the fine print, the dense, legalistic language designed to confuse and entrap. They searched for a loophole, a mistake, any small crack in its ironclad authority. They found nothing. Hope began to dwindle as the first day bled into the second. On the morning of the third day, the black carriage returned. The man from the city was not alone. He had brought the lawman, and for a final, triumphant flourish, the merchant's wife, who stood beside him with a look of vindicated righteousness. A small crowd of townspeople had gathered at a distance, drawn by the promise of drama. The man from the city stepped onto the porch. The time is up. The rancher stood in the doorway, blocking the entrance. He was calm, his stillness a stark contrast to the antagonist's smug energy. The woman and her children were clustered behind him, a silent, terrified audience. They're not going with you, the rancher said, his voice quiet but carrying in the tense silence. The man from the city laughed. And what will you do to stop me? You have no legal standing here. This is a matter of property, not sentiment. He turned to the lawman. Do your duty. The lawman took a reluctant step forward. This was the moment. The rancher looked past the antagonist, his gaze sweeping over the watching townspeople, landing on the hateful face of the merchant's wife. He drew a deep breath. That contract is void, he declared, his voice ringing with a new authority. She is to be my wife. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The merchant's wife's jaw dropped. The man from the city stared, momentarily stunned, before letting out a bark of derisive laughter. A desperate gesture. A marriage of convenience will not nullify a prior legal debt. The rancher's eyes narrowed. He took a step forward, onto the porch, planting himself firmly in the dirt of the ranch yard. He was no longer just defending his home. He was claiming his family in the eyes of the world. I'll marry her, he said, his voice rising, clear and strong, a public proclamation for all to hear, and raise all 6 of her children as mine. The words, so simple, so monumental, hung in the air. It was an oath, a challenge, a complete and total declaration of war. It was the ultimate shield, a man staking his name, his honor, and his future to protect them. The woman, standing in the doorway, felt tears well in her eyes. The sheer, unbelievable power of his vow washed over her, a wave of protection so absolute it left her breathless. But the law was still the law. The antagonist, recovering his composure, sneered. A noble speech. It changes nothing. The contract predates any romantic arrangement. Lawman, proceed. The lawman hesitated, his hand on his sidearm, his face a mask of conflict. Just as he was about to move, a sound cut through the tension, the frantic drumming of hoofbeats. A rider was approaching at a full gallop, a lathered horse churning up the mud. It was the young man from the town's telegraph office, waving a piece of paper. He skidded to a halt and thrust the telegram at the lawman. This just came through. It's an answer to the rancher's wire. Urgent. The lawman took the paper and read it. His eyes widened. He read it again, then slowly lifted his head. His gaze fell upon the man from the city, and his expression had transformed from one of weary duty to cold, hard fury. Well, the lawman said, his voice dripping with ice. It seems our fine gentleman from the city is known by another name in 3 other territories. A swindler, a forger, and wanted for fraud. His contracts have been declared null and void by a federal judge. He folded the telegram neatly and tucked it into his pocket. Looks like you'll be taking a journey after all. Just not with the company you were expecting. The antagonist's face collapsed, the smug confidence replaced by a stark, primal fear. He made a move to run, but the lawman was faster, his pistol suddenly in his hand. The merchant's wife let out a small, horrified squeak and took a step back, as if his corruption were contagious. Her moment of triumph had curdled into a public humiliation of the highest order. The lawman clapped the irons on the sputtering, defeated man. As he led his prisoner away, he paused beside the rancher. He looked at the woman and her children, safe in the shelter of the doorway. He looked at the rancher, standing solid as an oak tree. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of profound respect. "Looks like you had it handled," the lawman said, a small, weary smile on his face. Then he was gone. The spring that followed was a season of rebirth in more ways than one. The ranch, once a place of stark solitude, was now filled with the sounds of life. The laughter of children replaced the mournful sigh of the wind in the eaves. A garden was planted near the cabin, its neat rows a testament to the woman's hopeful hands. The rancher began building an addition to the house, the rhythmic thump of his hammer a song of creation, not just maintenance. He was a man transformed. The deep, weary sadness in his eyes was replaced by a quiet contentment. The ghosts of his past had not vanished, but they no longer haunted him. They had made room for the living. He taught the oldest boy how to mend a fence and ride a horse, seeing in the boy's earnest face not a replacement for the son he had lost, but a new and different reason to look toward the future. He found himself smiling, a slow, unaccustomed stretching of muscles long dormant. The woman was transformed as well. The hunted, desperate look was gone, replaced by the calm confidence of a woman who had found her place. She was no longer a refugee, but a partner. She managed the household, kept the books, and worked alongside him, her quiet strength a perfect counterbalance to his. They were married by a traveling preacher in a simple ceremony in the ranch yard, with the foreman and his hands as witnesses. It had begun as a declaration of protection, but it had become a quiet truth. One evening, as the sun bled orange and purple across the horizon, they sat together on the newly built porch. The children were playing a game of tag in the yard, their shouts and laughter a gentle melody on the evening air. The silence between the man and the woman was no longer a space of emptiness or caution, but one of shared understanding, a comfortable quiet built from 1,000 shared moments. She rested her hand on his. "You gave us a home," she said softly. He looked out at the children, then at the vast, beautiful land that stretched before them. He thought of the empty cabin he had returned to for 3 long years, and the vibrant, noisy, wonderful home it had become. He covered her hand with his own. "A home is not the land you own," he said, his voice filled with a certainty he had not felt in a very long time. "It is the people you choose to protect on it."